Dr. Jayashankar, thank you so much. There's a lot in those notes for us to unpack. Perhaps I could start by asking you a slightly broader question. In 2016, you had some kind of a geopolitical conception in mind when the various conversations on technology started and the geopolitics of sort of technology. The GTS is perhaps one small derivative of that. Could you give us a sense of what those conceptions were back in 2016 and how have they changed, if at all, as you sit here for the 8th edition?
You know, when we started this, I'm not sure.
Yeah, you're good, sir.
This is working. Okay. When we started it, actually, I think multiple factors drove it. One was a very simple proposition, which was the Prime Minister actually actively encouraged forums in India, which he felt would be useful, impactful, both in getting Indians a wider exposure to what the world is thinking, but more important, to get the world to focus a little bit more on what India was thinking. So that was a generic, shall I say, encouragement. So it wasn't just GTS, a number of other platforms came up at the same time. The second, as I mentioned, is actually the centrality of technology to governance, because I think very early on there was a belief that if we are to really rapidly progress, if we are to leapfrog, uh, everybody has, I mean, the history of the world, countries have leapfrogged by actually using a pathway which is faster, smoother, more efficient, more impactful than the pathways used by others. So a lot of us could see even by 2016, I mean, what today we call DPI. I mean, this DPI was long in the making. In fact, I remember something which Nandan has written, which was that when he went around the country talking to chief ministers about Aadhaar, he said the only chief minister who gave him complete and utter attention was the chief minister of Gujarat, who put every other business away and then spent hours with him, figuring out where all this could go. I think the centrality of technology to better governance, to good governance, was a second factor. The third, honestly, was my own belief, that again, this is a pre-digital era belief that if one looks at history in terms of quantum jumps, that jump to the next orbit is usually based on a particular technology or a set of technologies which have actually changed the framework. And in fact, my own PhD was really what did nuclear technology, what did the promise of nuclear technology, even as the Second World War was taking place, do to the behavior of powers in dealing with each other. And after the war ended, after the first two bombs were dropped, how every other, the other relevant nations actually saw in that technology sort of key factors which would advance their prospects. I think a whole set of these things came together. And of course, it was also helpful that I could bounce it off Raja Mohan at that time. And that's really how the conference started.
If I can pick up one or two strands from there, India has a pretty incredible digital journey that's very clear. We seem to be embarking now on a kind of a new era, if lack of a better term, slightly higher up in the value chain when it comes to manufacturing. You've spoken and often wrote about reglobalization. Now, to me, reglobalization would mean the deconcentration of economic production in any one geography or jurisdiction, opening our pathways, better supply chains, etc. Could you give us a sense of how do you see reglobalization today?
I think you have put your finger on the key issue, which is over concentration. That what had happened really I'd say between 1990s till the COVID, was that for a very wide variety of goods, technologies, and even services, we had actually all become dependent on a single geography. And it really took the COVID to wake up the world. It woke up the world because if the dependence was, I would say, at the cutting edge, we would have still probably rationalized it, though actually that is the part which should be causing the most concern. But because the dependence was actually very basic, that if the rest of the world couldn't even figure out how to get enough masks and ventilators and PPEs, and that's when it really hit home to people that maybe something hasn't gone right with the way the world has gone. So once those 2-3 years, the kind of anxieties and pressures and stresses that pretty much every country went through in the world, I think it's fundamentally changed the global conception of how a globalized economy should be run. A globalized economy doesn't mean that production gets done at the center and everybody else is a consumer. A globalized economy means dispersed production. It means enough plan Bs and Cs, not where things to go wrong, when things go wrong, because it will certainly go wrong. So the more we realize, pandemic was one. I think we've had climate events happening with greater regularity. We've seen conflicts which have disrupted the international trade flows. So our understanding of disruptions has become sharper. Our worries about concentrated production is greater. I think you put 2 and 2 together, and you will arrive at the need for a reglobalization. Now, I'm not saying reglobalization is happening. I'm saying that that's really what we should be aiming for. And if key countries understand it, and if enough businesses understand it, they will take the world in that direction. It will not happen overnight. It may not even happen volumetrically, which is, that a large part of global manufacturing gets spread all over the world. But it may happen in sensitive areas that's why this whole stress today on reliable and resilient supply chains.
If India is, and you've laid out a vision in the keynote that you gave, especially on semiconductors, where it definitely seems to many of us from the outside that in fact the government is more than deadly serious. And we just had a big company that broken ground in Gujarat. The hope is that ecosystem will grow even further. But for reglobalization, Minister, if I could say, there seems to be at least two preconditions. One is internal to us, which is that are we in the place where we can absorb the disruptions that are taking place in other parts of the world and make the best of them? And the other is perhaps what we're already doing, or what we see from the outside, is forging new partnerships.
I would say a kind of a partial yes to both, but very much work in progress. What happens often, and it's a very human habit. We tend to benchmark ourselves against our own past. So we would say, yes, it's easier to do business because it's better today in 2023 than it was in 2018, which was better than 2013 and whatever. But beyond the point, that doesn't cut much ice, because the investor is not really looking at you against yourself. They're looking at you against competitors. So clearly, it's one area where we need to keep improving our openness and our, I would say, ability to be credible as a manufacturing location. It isn't just the business rules. I think a large part of it is also the nature of the workforce. To the extent that today the emphasis is much more on, the kind of emphasis we have seen on skill development, on innovation, on on training. These are relatively new in India. I mean, they are less than a decade old, and there's a long way to go here. I mean, if one were to do a workforce comparison, we will not necessarily come out well from it. So I would say, therefore, yes, there is a lot that we could do, but at some stage you got to start doing it. We don't want to go to the other extreme and say, oh, we're no good at it, so let's not even have a shot at it. And there are people who are peddling that narrative as well. So to me, how do we, go along this path as effectively and sort of seriously as we can? So you had a number of pieces here. You've had this production-linked incentive initiative. As I said, you had an expansion of technical education, a much more serious skilling program, and easier to do business approach, and easier a de-bureaucratizing of the system in a way, what we call ease of living. So there are there are a lot of moving parts here which need to come together. Many of them have come together, but there's a long way to go here. The other part of it is the international partners. Now, here what happens is the politics of technology actually is not congruent necessarily with the politics of geostrategy, or the politics of culture, or the politics of post-colonial preferences and antipathies. So I mean, if one looks today at where are your preferred partners, for a country like India, it's not an easy question to answer, because your preferred partners depends on which domain you are looking at. Depending on the domain, you will have a set of partners, many of whom would overlap, but many of whom would not. And I have always been clearly advocative of the fact that when it comes to technology in the broadest possible sense, really our natural partner are the economies of the Western, our Western economies. And if you see today, I mean, which is why, I mean, Quad has been helpful. The TTC with EU has been helpful. These are our, I would say, technology partners. They are our markets in a way. They are our investors in different ways. These are also places where the mobility from which this country can also benefit, the skills development would happen. So I would certainly say there is a big agenda there for particularly in respect of the US and Europe.
If I could just pick up the point about the US, there are some who would argue that the agenda over the last couple of years and everything that you framed here would push us to some kind of overdependence. Now, maybe there's a different way of thinking about that, and it's certainly not my view. But there seems to be a view that this dependence, interdependence is a difficult game. And there seems to be that we are in a spot where there may be a bit too much overdependence. I was just wondering, how do you think, and perhaps I could ask you for one more is, you've often said that technology is as much about political science. If different political formulations were to develop in Western countries that we're dealing with today, would that dislodge any of the agenda setting that we're trying to put in place today?
Give me the second one again.
Maybe I'll try and be maybe more direct.
I thought I was the diplomat in the room, but...
If there's a different political makeup in the US by next year this time, and if different forces change in Europe, for instance, does that by in any way jeopardize our technology path and the investments that we're making in the partnership with the United States or others?
The first question, are we getting over-dependent? Usually I find over-dependence is a rationalization of inaction, which is you don't want to do something, you say, oh, don't do it, because if you do it, you'll get over-dependent. Secondly, I've noticed that the over-dependence argument is it's a very curious argument. You use it against some countries, but not apparently against other countries. Look at India's trade figures and tell me, where are we over-dependent? I can tell you where we are over-dependent. The accounts where we have enormous trade deficits and where often we are dependent on for very basic things. But that's not where you hear the over-dependence argument. So, you know, sometimes technology could be political science, but politics sometimes masquerades as national security as well. I think there are ideological agendas, and those ideological agendas are, if you move too closely towards a certain set of countries, that is over-dependence. But if you do the same with other set of countries, it's not over-dependence. But put that aside. The issue, if there are changes in the US, political changes in the US or in Europe, does that make a difference? My considered sense is no. I'll tell you why. Look at the data. Okay, let's take the US. So we can argue about the inflection point for the latest, for where we have arrived. I would say one inflection point would be 2000, Clinton coming here. One would be 2005, nuclear deal. One could be maybe 2014, Modi's visit. And one definitely, I would say, was this visit, because this visit of Modi's was the most expansive, ambitious in terms of spelling out the cooperation. Now, the interesting thing about the US is you've actually had 5 completely different presidents. I mean, think Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden. Now, if a relationship can actually prosper with 5 very different presidents, I would suggest to you that the data clearly indicates a certain sort of stability and a certain there's enough investment on both sides. There's a certain structural soundness to this relationship. So I'm not saying politics doesn't matter. Of course it does. The arguments could be different. That the nature of negotiations could be different. But I think today I'm now giving you an Indian view of it, an American view of it may be couched in a different way. But I think today, from an Indian perspective, India-US relations is certainly proofed against political change. Where Europe is concerned, I think we are frankly much less of an issue there. There's less community there in terms of their own calculations. We are less salient. So I do not really see us even being a subject of debate. So I'm quite confident that, because we can all see changes will come. I mean, some developments in Europe have shown that you can have ups and downs. And it's in the nature of democracy as well that things like that can happen. But I'm pretty confident that certainly a large part of the India-US and India-Europe conversations on technology, and not just on technology, actually on strategic convergence and shared strategic interests, I think they are well proofed against the politics of the day.
Minister, if I could pick up the question on Europe. Is Europe clearly, I mean, from what we make out from the outside and we read you and others, is that Europe played a central role in a conceptualization of what you often refer to as a multipolar world, multi-vector world in its sense. Last year, this time, the UTTC existed, but it was yet to be fleshed out. You had a very high-level meeting this summer, where now there's an agenda for action. Could you give us a sense of how that unfolds on the TTC side?
The idea of a TTC came from actually President von der Leyen when she was visiting India. And I mean, it's an interesting proposal. There was one which the EU had done with the US. But you know, the nature of the US-EU relationship is significantly different. It's a far more mature, advanced relationship than ours is. But we've done 2 sessions so far. We did one in Brussels, and we just did one a few days ago virtually. And we are hoping very much to do a physical one early next year. And it's been very helpful because we really didn't have, see, unlike with the US, you know, with the US, we've had a long conversation on strategic trade. In fact, a conversation which goes back to the early 80s, to the Reagan administration. And the first agreement which we did with the US was as long back as 1984. Uh, so, uh, so in our, you know, for us, export control, licensing, these have always been big subjects with the US. With Europe, that has never been high on the radar. So today, when we are moving to an era where control on technologies and strategic trade is making a comeback, I think it's crucial we have that conversation, partly because India is both a bigger consumer and generator of technology, partly because Europe's relevance on that has gone up, and also because the India-EU relation, you know, the volumes of India-EU trade and investment have gone up. So there was a good case. It was, I think, a very sort of well-timed European initiative. We were very glad to respond, and I do think, you know, this is something which will go forward.
You brought up export controls, Minister. You'd be glad to know that we have about 30 US officials who are here for GTS, so perhaps a bit too much for our team to deal with, but they're here and we're very glad they're there. And I see Jonathan Finest sitting here as well. And a lot of them are here to do a various workshops with our companies, MSMEs, startups. Many of our startups, as you mentioned in the keynote, now have serious capability, especially in space, dual use, AI. And there's a kind of not a new, but there's a renewed conversation perhaps between the two sides in terms of us knocking on their doors to access technology, licensing. Some of it is just getting through ambiguity in its sense. But one part that sometimes comes up in these conversations is, especially on the export control side, is the highlight of overdependence that we have with another jurisdiction, such as Russia, for instance. And I was just wondering if you can give us a sense, when and if this war ends, how do you see our relationship and our military dependence on Russia panning out over the next many years?
You know, look, again, I put it to you, over-dependence is a very, very loaded term. Huh? It's what you use when you don't want the other guy to do something, okay? When you want them to do it, you never talk about it. I mean, again, we have a relationship with Russia. It's not a relationship which happened in one instant, one day, 1 month, 1 year. It is an accumulated relationship of close to 60 years. And it's a relationship which happened because the direction of world politics during those 50, 60 years actually helped forge that relationship. So, because, you know, often I see the problem defined in a way as though somewhere there's some handicap that India has by having this relationship. This relationship has saved us at times. So, whether we are over-dependent or not, actually at the end of the day depends on us. You know, if we have multiple partners, if we have the, you know, partly the skills to play them off, but we play them off while keeping good, you know, maintaining the level of trust and confidence with each one of them. If I have 4 good relations which are all working well, I'm not dependent on any of them. I'm certainly not over-dependent on any of them. So, I mean, do understand this, that, you know, partly there is a lot of history and the weight, the force of that, which has been today a defining aspect of the India-Russia relationship. Secondly, there is it's like strategy 101. I mean, if you look at the Eurasian landmass, just looking at the map, it makes sense that India and Russia would have strong relations, because it is in accordance with the first principle of politics of your neighbor's neighbor. So, so for us, there is a lot of logic to it. But what had happened in the past was, uh, we ended up in a situation, I'm not assigning responsibility for it, where our own options were constrained. Okay. What in the last 30 years, that has widened, and certainly I would assert in the last 10 years, it has widened even more. Now, as you have more options, it's natural for a country to make the best of it. And to make the best of it, you then become very considered and deliberate and judicious about which option you exercise in which domain to what extent. And that, in a way, today is what Indian foreign policy is about. I mean, it has become more complicated to practice, simply because actually my landscape has widened, my options have widened, I have become bigger, my footprint has grown bigger. So I have to somewhere get, it's like having a small portfolio versus a huge portfolio. The portfolio has got bigger, I will find a balance. If I find a balance, I'm not over-dependent.
Let me ask you a somewhat prosaic question. When portfolios become larger, we need more resources and capacities. Um, and this question gets asked often of political leaders and ministers about, are we doing enough on capacity? But on question of this geopolitics of technology, there are so many shifts taking place. We're involved in so many conversations across the world. There is reglobalization to an extent that's actually happening in manufacturing other places. We're seeing movement in data. We're seeing changes in digital public infrastructure for something that few knew last year to now we're thinking about Global South, Quad, etc. Is your ministry, if I may ask, a ministry that today perhaps needs to change to deal with the different kinds of capacity, not just in terms of numbers, but the complexity of the ecosystem we are now working?
Okay. You said, Rudra, at the beginning that, in the last year, so many things have happened. Okay. So we must have done something right? Now, if we had such severe constraints, and yet we did so many things right, either we are exceptionally smart, I don't want to say that about myself, or we have found a working style, methodology, which actually allows us to harness, many more forces in society. So, look, nobody in charge of any organization would say, my organization cannot grow. All of us would like to grow. It's a self-interest out there. But I have the limitations, not of Indian diplomacy, not of the Indian Foreign Service. I have the limitations of an entire Indian governance structure. If I was not the foreign minister, let us say, if I was a minister of some other department, I'm sure you could say the same of that department as well. You would say, well, maybe there are not enough policemen in India, there are not enough customs people in India, there are not enough income tax guys in India, all of which would probably be true. But what happens is, since I cannot dramatically change it, I actually have, over the years, found ways by which I use smart people like you to get a lot of my work done. In a lot of other societies, there wouldn't be a GTS. Some foreign ministry would be organizing an event like this. They wouldn't get such nice people to come there. So I think there is a certain, I would say, a certain way of working which has developed over the years. Because forget the numbers for a moment. Tell me the outcomes. I mean, if you were to say, Minister, your performance in the last 5 years has been terrible. You were missing at all the important moments. You didn't have enough people to attend meetings. You couldn't do the G20 properly. I don't know what you did when you went to the Security Council. You are invisible in the world. Yes, I would then maybe take your numbers explanation very, very seriously. But if you tell me, oh, by the way, you did this, I still think you have a numbers problem. Then
I think that's a perfect answer. You brought up the G20, and as we kind of move to closing the conversation, it's been an incredible year for India. I mean, I think the involvement of various networks of people, ecosystems, and you just reflected on the government's different ways of working with people, using different ecosystems, working with them. It was really, literally, the kind of people's G20 as we saw it here. You've spoken of the G20 in the context also of an expression of a more dynamic form of multilateralism, and a good expression and perhaps good empirical example of how that dynamism can really come to bear. How do we sustain this process going ahead and as we now hand over the baton to Brazil and beyond?
uh, you know, I'm now getting a little ahead of myself. But let us say 2, 3, 4 years from now, if one looks back at this G20, I suspect that the 3 reasons it would be remembered would be: one, the fact that it put DPI, digital public infrastructure, center stage in terms of a global developmental narrative. Number 2, I think it refocused attention on the fact that we are falling behind on SDGs in the most alarming way, and that it was something which had been the other events, more compelling events, had pushed that to the side. And number 3, I would say it would be remembered as one major step of reforming the global order where Africa actually got a place. Now, how do we take it forward? To some extent, I think the G20 structure helps us because it's a troika-driven structure. So we made sure that every step of the way, whatever we did, we copied the Brazilians. So when the baton has been handed over to them, it's seamless. I mean, they know everything we know, and we remain attached as a Troika member to that. And it's also helpful that South Africa follows after Brazil, because again, we certainly, as the hosts and the prime movers of the G20, a lot of what, the diplomacy which happened centered around us. But I must say that to a great degree, Brazil and South Africa, particularly when we were close to the last mile, were helpful in forging, because finally, look, the G20 came together. Every one of the G20 members, in some way or the other, did something to buy into the outcome document. And many of them had very strong positions. So we have to also give them credit that for a larger cause, for a bigger message, many of them actually made adjustments to their position. I think this is a kind of a global happening which should not be lightly disregarded. So everybody did their share, but I would say the next two, the Brazil, South Africa, we were very much at the heart of what happened in that last phase. So I'm very confident that the kind of the traditions, the culture, the getting things together. I actually forgot to add the fourth, which was really IFI reform. It didn't happen in Delhi, but I think the Marrakesh meeting in October, which happened the month after, is hugely consequential. We haven't seen the full import of that play out. But I would say again, if we do see really a big push in terms of development funding in the world, especially green funding, I think people would look back and say, okay, a lot of that goes to what happened at the Marrakesh finance ministers meeting.
No, thank you, Minister. To close out, if I can ask, you joined the Foreign Service, if I got my math right, 46 years ago.
Yeah, yes.
In 2019, you became our 30th Foreign Minister. What were the opportunities, if I can just ask, that you saw perhaps in 2019? And what are the opportunities that you see today as you're close to closing out your first term as the Foreign Minister and hopefully many more terms? But what are the opportunities that you see for India today, looking at the next few years?
You know, look, coming in 2019, I had the experience of being Foreign Secretary before that. Then fortunately, a bit of a break, which helped me to get a better understanding of how business really works. So we came in, obviously, with a lot of ideas, a great deal of ambition, I would say, because the first term had put in place many, at least many of the concepts which we wanted to take forward in the second term. And, it could be concepts in terms of how do you prioritize the world, a neighborhood, an extended neighborhood, key partners, areas of interest, take the Quad further. There were a whole set of issues out there. When I look coming to the end of the term, I would say what obviously we didn't see coming. None of us saw the COVID coming and how transformational COVID would be. We look in terms of our own lifestyles, but certainly in terms of what it has done to the world's thinking about the world, it's hugely consequential. Second, we obviously, this is an India issue particularly. Again, it would have been very difficult to foresee the downturn of our relations with China. And what the consequences of that actually have been to our national security and diplomacy. Then, of course, we have the Ukraine conflict. We have the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, though I would argue that could and to some degree was foreseen. It was like a long goodbye, but that goodbye was evident even before 2019. And of course, now what we are seeing in West Asia. So if in these 5 years you had 5-6 such globally consequential events, it's clearly a very, very different world that we are looking at. But my sort of considered self-assessment would be that in each case, we have sought to absorb the event, respond in the most effective way, even where possible, use it to advance or to gain in some manner. And I think if you use these 5 events, and this is from an Indian perspective, really the COVID, the China relationship, the Afghanistan issue, the conflict in Ukraine, the Middle East, I think put together, I would overall say that we haven't done a bad job.
Dr. Jaishankar, thank you so much for opening GTS. Thank you for your time and your thoughtful remarks. We'll unpack a lot of this over the next 2.5 days, at least on the technology side. And we really appreciate your time and support. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.